In the New York City public service system, the government is run by two unique but equally vital groups: the elected and appointed officials who design initiatives and the employees tasked with implementing them. These are our stories.
All right, welcome back to Civil Conversations, everyone. It's Liz. Today, we're going to be talking about the migrant crisis here in New York City. And this is a topic I've been wanting to talk about for quite some time. It's obviously not anything new, but something, if you're following the news or if you're walking around New York City, seems to be something that has been exploding. And trying to get a sense, or at least open up a conversation about this with colleagues, and to maybe surface some things that we can talk about, elevate, and to get people to advocate in whichever way they sort of identify. So we'll be approaching this conversation to talk about sort of the origins and the development of the migrant crisis here in New York City over the last year. We're actually approaching a year with folks in the news of folks being bused from along the border, from states like Texas, from Florida, and the political sort of battles that have happened and ensued over the past 18 months, which as a result have brought over 90,000 people to New York City. We've always been a place of immigrants, so this recent conversation has been an interesting one to me. We've always been a place of immigrants dating back to the 1600s. I actually encountered a really cool CUNY website, which I'll share in the show notes, but trying to trace back and understand the history of immigration and the transition of folks from around the country into New York City. Having been born and raised here, I've always known it's just like a melting pot of various cultures and people who come from all over the world, not just some of the cultures that have become synonymous with New York City, but we actually are representative of 150 countries. And so if we have always been a place of immigrants, something interesting that I learned as well is that even dating back to the 1600s when we were a colony, is that New York City was indeed, and I learned this from that CUNY website, the second highest in terms of slave trade and utilization at that time, second to Charleston. So I always associated slavery with the South, never with the North, right? I thought people always escaped slavery and came to the North, but New York City is actually the second largest slave trade space. And so we have, if you want to view it that way, used and I guess can trace back to using imported labor, having immigrants come to support the development, the expansion, the growth of New York City, this, the sustenance, maintenance of it for a very long time. We've had immigrants over the years, waves of immigrants that have helped us expand from our initial staking in Lower Manhattan, expanding north across the boroughs. We've had phases of Irish, Italians, Chinese, Jewish, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Russians, you fill in the blank. All of them have come in different waves to support different levels of expansion, different types of projects that we know, but perhaps don't know the context behind how they were developed over the years in New York City. And I will, again, link to that, link to the CUNY. It has a bunch of different sort of how can I say it, like different lectures, short lectures that show you about the different waves and the different phases of immigration in New York City and how different cultures, what they escaped from, what they were seeking in New York City, and what they helped to develop. And so you see things like support during the wars that made us a country that we are, to things that immigrants did to make us the financial sort of center and capital of the world that we are today, and help develop a lot of the landmarks that people come to visit and have come to love and perhaps take for granted. So stuff like the Brooklyn Bridge, folks who helped make and our tunnels, the grid block system that we know of, like, oh, I'm on 31st and 2nd, all of that was built and developed with help of immigrant labor over the years. Housing, canals, labor later on in factories, at docks, etc. So all these things that supported what New York City is today came a lot from waves of immigrants that have shaped us to be the melting pot that we are today. And so with that in mind, it's sort of a question of if in modern day we still rely on immigrant labor for things like childcare, restaurants, hospitality, medical and home care, construction, and you fill in the blank, what sort of what sort of makes this such a phenomenon, right? So we are seeing an influx of folks arriving in the city, but it doesn't seem like it's been sustainable. Is it a question of mismanagement, or is it a question of a flow of immigrants versus a trickle that we may be used to because they came in through other means? And so I want to explore this topic today, and I'm super grateful to welcome a colleague of mine, Crystal, who I worked with for several years. And I invited her to come speak about this conversation because, over years of working with her, I think she's a person who could speak to this from multiple vantage points. So one, she's a first generation New Yorker. She's a child of an immigrant, and has always brought that lens and that perspective to her work. And I applaud her for that. Being in conversations about, we're translating these materials and flagging that some of the things that we're doing are inaccessible or going to be hard for people to comprehend, or trying to advocate that oftentimes it's children who are serving as translators for their parents, as service navigators for their parents, and trying to be mindful of how complex we're making things, how difficult and hard we're making language to navigate, processes to navigate. And so that's always been something that she's brought to her work. And she has transitioned to working into this space as something that's a personal sort of passion, of course, with this experience. So moving on from working for the city to working in this space. And so I thought she'd be a great person to come and just explore this from a personal vantage point. Also, as a New Yorker, lives here with her family. And so trying to get a sense of what it's like to be an immigrant. And then also in doing this work and seeing it and encountering it in New York City at a personal level, what are some things that we're finding, and what are some things maybe that we could be doing better or being more mindful of? So welcome, Crystal, and thank you for joining me. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much, Liz.
Of course, of course. So I wanted to start the conversation, of course, by allowing you to share your experience. It could be, your personal experience, your experience working for the city, and your work. You could choose your adventure. But I just wanted to share from myself. I'm Puerto Rican. I'm of Puerto Rican descendants, but I'm a third generation, actually, in New York City. My first generation were folks who came from the island of Puerto Rico in the 1950s, were factory workers, textile workers, and such. So I have the privilege, and it is a privilege, to be a third generation person here in New York City. So I don't know what it's like. And there's things that I'm sure I take for granted in not navigating, even as a Latina, what it's like to be new to this country, to navigate that, the things you encounter and such. And so I wanted to sort of invite you to share your experience and perhaps give people a lens of what it's like to be new to the city. What circumstances are people coming from? What challenges might you encounter? And anything else you might have from your experience growing up here and encountering that.
Yeah, for sure. So my mom is originally from Mexico, specifically in Puebla. We're from a very little tiny town with just a population of about 600 people, which is
Wow.
mostly elders for the most part. And we have a very large community of them in Brooklyn, which I just recently found out in the last 2 to 3 years. My last name started getting recognized at different stores, and somehow, some way, I also met someone who knew my uncle, which unfortunately he passed away. But it was just like a full circle moment of just how tiny this world is. That's just a little cherry on top that I found out in the last 2 years. But as a first generation child, I think that there's so many challenges that come with being first generation, especially as being the translator of all things from head to toe. At a very young age, I don't have a memory of the youngest, maybe around 8, I started translating, perhaps even younger than that at that point, because I was in school. I also entered the public education system knowing Spanish. I didn't know English right off the bat. So I also was part of ESL, which is called English for Spanish speaking learners, if I'm not mistaken. At the time, I think they changed what it's called now, but
that's English language learners, because now we have so many languages, which was sad. It was just unique to Spanish, but yeah. There you go.
Right. But at the time, maybe it was just a large population of just Spanish speakers and just first generation kids entering the public school system. And from the very get-go, I remember filling out a bunch of paperwork, whether that's school applications, that's getting Medicare for health insurance, going to the doctor, going to the dentist, going to get your eyes checked, absolutely anything. There was the expectation of all the adults in the room on myself to translate for my mom. It was never really an instance where it was offered to have a translator in the room. Is
Sure.
more so let's connect the dots with a little bit of language I have and hope that my mom gets it. Um, so from a very young age, I had to learn and navigate a bunch of things in every single part of my life with my mom, just because she also would not learn English. I think there's a very big pride and joy in her that connects her to Mexico and just knowing Spanish and sticking to that. But I will say she did come around to understanding it. And then as I grew, that kind of language disappeared in a
Mm-hmm.
way. What I think most people don't understand when people arrive here is that they're arriving with absolutely nothing on their back except for the labor that they learned, which is cleaning, cooking, just the basic labor work that nobody would think of, that no one wants to kind of do. Um, and for that, it's challenging to navigate not knowing the language in a whole nother country, trying to find something better, and also just creating a family.
Mm-hmm.
Um, why New York City residents and local communities should be open and supportive. I think in overall, like you mentioned, New York City has just been so welcoming to migrants for as long as I can remember. Yes, there was this kind of thing where I was prepped for if ICE ever was to come, here's all the paperwork that you need to know about, and here's what's going to happen next if something happens to me. But in New York City, I never felt that ICE presence or that scare to
Mm-hmm.
others like who are in Texas or Arizona or the different parts of the city. I mean, the states.
Just saying there was a
And
conversation that your mom had is sort of like to prepare you that if ever I'm asked to leave or if I need to leave, these are things you need to know.
yes.
Well,
So for that, it's kind of this one where you're preparing an 8-year-old child to possibly have to navigate a bunch of things with adults and paperwork and all the legal stuff,
mm-hmm.
because there is an instance where she can be taken out of our lives, but we're fully dependent on her as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just the way that New York City has been approaching immigration, like we've passed the 1, 2, 3 green light campaign or law that allows undocumented people to have a license. That
Mm-hmm.
changed so many things for so many people in the community. And during the COVID time, even highlighting some of these grants that went out for undocumented people to support them during the crisis. Because if we're being honest, people who are undocumented are really the people who are making the sandwiches, who are making your deliveries,
Mm-hmm.
who are picking things who are just picking up fruit and all these things, right? Like all of these things come from somewhere. And every time we look at where it comes from, it kind of comes from undocumented people who are doing the work.
Yep. Yep. It's interesting you say that because again, I'll point back to that CUNY website. But as they mentioned, sort of these waves of immigrants over the years and over the centuries, even there was sort of this sentiment at the time that those that were coming into work in the city, coming in through, Ellis Island, or mainly at the time, probably Ellis Island, but they were unskilled, as people would say, and so not to say that that's true, but that was the perception of people coming through. And so there's certain types of work, as you mentioned earlier, the grunt work, the work that people didn't want to do, or the work that wasn't safe, like building a bridge, like building a building, when we didn't have some of the attempted sort of safeguards that we have today. Those were often the jobs that people were given, right? And they would do it because they were escaping places where they could not make money or were working to send money back to their countries and to their families, and came here to get by and to try and make a better life for themselves. So it's interesting how many of those same sentiments still exist today. It's just different communities, different countries, different cultural groups than those that maybe did come centuries ago. But I'd say people escaping from the same things and coming into the same circumstances of like, hey, you're stepping in to do this work that, needs to get done, but perhaps is like not the most appealing to folks who are from here, or, is without a reach realistically, right, and cost for certain people. It's labor at a more affordable cost for some folks. So that's a real thing people might not want to admit, but it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of it in general, the way that you see it, you can see it from so many different point of views. My perspective is just living through it my entire life, still to this day, just navigating through it, learning about it, living it with my mom. There's so many different perspectives that can come out of it for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, I guess getting back to the point earlier of trying to address the trickle versus the flow that we have now, or some people see it as like an inundation, where we started to call it a crisis, right? Of folks coming in and us not being able to sustain the volume of people arriving. I mean, it's interesting because as I was doing my research, it showed that as of the last census, and of course the census sometimes can be, and it can't sometimes, it is outdated, right? Because the way that's collected and then reported and such, there's definitely a lapse in the time of showing the reflectiveness of that information. But based on our last census, we did have a decline of immigrants in New York City and New York State, to the point where there was a push to try and encourage folks to come back to New York City. Many had left for reasons that many of us who live in New York City know. It's like, it's not always like cupcakes and rainbows. It's a concrete jungle where dreams are made of, or sometimes broken. Like New York City can be beautiful or it can be horrible, right? And so apparently there was a flight of folks moving to other cities and states across the country. And so there had been a drop in immigrant populations here in the city and in the state. And of course, with the flight of folks during COVID, we saw a drop in our population, right? So I just find it fascinating that here we are in 2023, where we have rebounded in a sense, but like we are back to being home to 8.8 million people. And a fraction of that, these 100,000 folks, are the ones who have recently come in. And the reality is that, as we've mentioned, there's benefits to having immigrants in a community. Some countries indeed are actually trying to attract immigrants to boost their economies. So it's, interesting as to like whether we're not galvanizing on the opportunity and why it's like approached as such a crisis. Is it because we have an aversion to attracting people here, or is it a matter of it being sort of framed in a negative light, or is it just like process? I think the interesting thing is that there are some people who apparently have come here through this process of coming from the southern states, coming up to New York City, some in very different circumstances, but like if they had college degrees and perhaps were able to get work permits or had family here, they have been able to sort of establish themselves. But for those that did not have those types of opportunities or didn't have those networks, there are those who are like sort of stuck in the hotels and out on the streets that we're seeing. And so just curious, like, as to your thoughts, I guess it's just interesting. Like, if we need immigrants, we hear constantly that we need people to work, right? Restaurants are shutting down. Restaurants couldn't open because they didn't have staffing. You have, help wanted signs in lots of places. And some people were saying like they're actually showing up, but it's just the paperwork and the process is not aligned. And many people are willing to work, but as you mentioned, they're just sort of idle and living in circumstances that really are horrible. It actually makes me quite sad, because if you have people coming here to look for a better quality of life, what we have come to see certainly is not that. And so just wanting to start to talk about like ways that, what is it that we're missing? If someone is coming here for a better opportunity and we need the help, is this, from your perspective, personal, whatever, and we could always circle back to this too, but is this sort of like a missed opportunity? And can we be supporting these folks? Is it really the crisis that we're saying or being told it is? Or are we just sort of like framing this to make it look like, oh, we have these people sitting here and there's nowhere for them to go? It's like we had all these holes during COVID and we have the needs. So what's the real deal? Like, based on what you're seeing, Is it indeed a crisis? Is it an issue of mismanagement, or is it just because the volume is just really that much that we cannot keep up with the number of people who are arriving?
For sure. I think back to like the different perspectives that you can really see this based on where you're reading about what's happening in New York City, down to the tabloids, right? Of the media that you're consuming. All of it can be interpreted in so many different ways. Again, with New York City being so well, excuse me, so welcoming to just people from all over the place, I think we just need to view it from a point of view of empathy, of just like everything that these folks are going through. From my personal experience and my mom's personal experience and my family's, the stories that they sometimes talk about when they're having a couple beers and, having a family gathering. Yes, there's tales and laughter in between, but there's also so much trauma
Mm.
that they have with them that they don't talk about because they're on a hustle mode of, I've arrived to the States, I got to make some money, I got to find an apartment, I got to send back money to family back home. And I think that's kind of where everyone's coming from when they arrive to New York City. There's opportunities, there's support. There are so many organizations that are already out here doing the legwork to support people, but I don't think that people know about them just because in the last few years, like you've mentioned, like we've had a decline in undocumented people in New York City. I didn't even know that was happening. And now all of a sudden we're calling this a migrant crisis. So I think it's just about the point of view of where you're coming from, approaching it from just an empathy point of view, because yes, I think for the most part in the tabloids and the news, we're seeing majority of it being men and not really highlighting that it's more than just men. Some of these men, quote unquote, are teenagers. They're starting from ages 13 to 15, 13 to 18. Either way, these are children who have gone through so much trauma to get here. So much pain, so much hunger, so much confusion because they probably aren't speaking to someone who speaks their language and kind of just being tossed left and right when they arrive here. And they don't have a say. They don't have a say in where they're going. They don't really have a say in pretty much anything, whether that's just because they can't communicate or they just are not sure what's going on in all. And for that, I think it's, again, just really the empathy part and seeing it from that perspective. And this isn't new. We haven't supported folks who have been arriving to New York City in different ways. I think that now it's just become this big highlight in the media. And it's quote unquote becoming a crisis. But there's so many organizations that are out here doing the work on the ground and supporting these people. Yes, there is an influx, but again, approaching it from an empathy point of view, trying to communicate with folks and just hearing out what's really going on from them, from all parties who are involved. I think we can get a strong communication
Sure.
that really just where it lies, because you can be told one thing, you can be seeing one thing. Just as recently as them entering Sunset Park Recreational Center, where all these quote unquote men are being now housed there, and the community is half and half, where half of them are kind of concerned about what's going on. The other half are approaching it with, let's welcome them, let's provide services, let's provide food, let's come together to welcome them. And for those two point of views, it's just, it came from a lack of communication. It just so happened that the night before this announcement went out, the recreational centers were now going to be used to house migrants. And the next day it's happening. And I think that, like, again,
Sure.
communication, right?
Sure.
Like, just communicate that it's happening. So one, all these organizations that are doing the legwork for the community already here are preparing to support the people who are going to be arriving. And just that comes from empathy, that comes from communication. And so just viewing it from those two point of views, I think can go a long way at how you read all of the articles and how all these things are being shown on social media and the love for TikTok and
Mhm.
all these people recording on their cameras, but really just think about it from an empathy point of view. These people, these folks, and everybody who's arriving has some sort of trauma, has wants to get out of poverty. There's so many things happening, and it's not coming just from one place. There's so many different countries of migrants arriving to the States, and that's another perspective of just assuming that everyone's quote unquote Mexican.
Oh yeah.
Where it's like, no, they're not only coming from Mexico. Yes, Mexico might be the predominantly border where Arizona and Texas align, or Arizona and so forth, but they're not only coming from Mexico. There's so many other countries that
Right.
and
Yeah.
people that are arriving.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the videos of the folks getting off these buses, which you do see in the media often, it is not just folks coming from South and Central America. And that's an interesting sort of, I guess, stereotype that or perception that people have, or the portrayal of folks who are coming and immigrating to the States and to New York City. And certainly, I mean, I can only imagine too for Mexico, right? They're the pathway, they're the gateway for this. So how many people are they dealing with? Like, as much as we're dealing with a crisis, all the folks who we turn back, where are they going? They're going back to Mexico. So it's probably like equally as troubling an experience, or phenomenon, I guess, for them to manage as well, because anyone who gets turned back, they're filtering and going back through Mexico as well. But I did want to sort of speak about that because there has been a certain portrayal and perception of this, and a lot of this dates back to this expiration of Title 42, and it prompted me to sort of look into and to research that a little bit more of like, what does this mean? Because I feel like there's always been, or at least we've heard stories about like border management and people coming into the United States in all types of ways. What's the legal way? What's the illegal way? And so if we did have this influx, like you mentioned, like what is causing this? And so I'll link to this in the show notes for those that are interested in reading up on Title 42. But there's this Associated Press article that mentions that the changes came with the end of the coronavirus restrictions. So during Trump's presidency, and understandably so, I guess there was this perhaps served a double purpose of them trying to address immigration, and also using coronavirus as a way to sort of address and limit immigration into the United States. That's just my personal view. But they had instituted restrictions under Title 42, which has been around since the 1940s, to curb migration in the name of protecting public health, is sort of what it says here. And it sort of like highlights this information that's come from during this transition. And ultimately, this was implemented in March of 2022, or reenacted in March of 2020, excuse me, and allowed U.S. officials to turn away migrants who came to the U.S.-Mexico border, which they said at the time on the grounds of preventing them for the spread of COVID-19, or to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But before that, it says migrants could cross illegally, ask for asylum, and be allowed into the U.S. They were then screened and often released to wait out their immigration cases. Under Title 42, migrants were returned over the border and denied the right to seek asylum. U.S. officials turned away migrants more than 2.8 million times, and families and children traveling alone were exempt. And it says here that there were no real consequences when someone illegally crossed the border, so migrants were able to try again and again to cross, on the off chance that they would get into the U.S. And initially, the Biden administration kept Title 42 in place, and then tried to end its use in 2022. Republicans sued, arguing that the restrictions were necessary for border security, but courts had kept the rule in place. Now they when they announced in January that we were ending the national COVID-19 emergency, these border restrictions have now gone away. So as a result, it seems like more people are able to qualify and apply for asylum, and are perhaps getting through that process with this Title 42, not necessarily like being a new wave of people, but people being, I guess, hip to the fact that this has been lifted and being able to get through easier than they had been in years prior, right? So it's not that these folks maybe didn't have the interest, but it's a little bit easier for them to get through. And to your point, I've seen and heard of people flying from China, from Eastern Europe, from the Middle East, people coming in from Africa to get in through Mexico, because I don't know how this goes, and this is to your point about communication. Folks in these home countries somehow, I don't know how this notification gets out, but they do. And I've heard some real horrible stories from folks who like are predators and capitalize on these opportunities to say to people, hey, you know, it's easy to get into US, just like let me get you there and give me this money and I'll get you there, it's easier. And they're promising people all these things, and then when they get here, it's like they may be able to get through, but then they're bus somewhere, and like you said, they're hopped around. In New York City, we've seen that people start in, you know, Port Authority, then they're sent to Randall's Island, then they're sent to Brooklyn. Like people are passed around, then they want to bus them up to Albany or send them someplace else. Like it's been a lot of misinformation, but it has been a pathway for people to access the US, not just from Central or South America, but from all over the world. And so just curious if you've heard like any of these stories of like what people are being told in their home countries, how they're finding out about this. And I think we've spoken about this, but of like the communication that's happening at the border. I saw an article about this where they're actually handing out flyers telling people like, don't come to New York City, which was news to me. I had not heard of anyone saying that. But apparently there is communications, and they're trying to send people down to the border, disseminating information, trying to discourage people from, I don't know if they're getting on the buses or, you know, if they even have a choice, like you said, but there is at a point earlier, and I want to go back to communication once people get here and the implications once they're in communities. But for those who are arriving, have you heard any stories? And if not, that's fine. But I just wanted to put that out there as like some things that I encountered in doing research for this, and it's just fascinating to see, one, the perceptions, and unfortunate actually about the perceptions of who's coming here. But it isn't just folks of a certain makeup and background that people aren't envisioning. And I think in a certain level, we're trying to think of the right word, but didn't get such a warm welcome over the past several years. So curious as to your thoughts there.
Yeah, I don't have anyone personally who kind of is hearing XYZ in either direction. I think for my point of view, the current folks who are here in the city, who are undocumented, who have been waiting several years, including my mom, is more so like what's happening with them, and can we hop on that same course of action, since we've also seeked asylum, we've arrived here, we are kind of going through the same things, and trying to just become a citizen in the United States, right? So for that, I didn't even know that the whole situation of flyers of discouraging people to come to the United States was happening. That's a big shocker for me, but also with all things happening in the last few years, and having more exposure to different types of news outlets, again, just because you can see something in the news. And growing up, I watched Univision 41, Telemundo, and really those were my news channels, right? And so they can interpret it and message it one way. The American news outlet can also interpret it and message it another way. Social media now can interpret it and message it out their own way. So that, I guess.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify that the flyers are, and I can post this link in the show notes, because again, sort of to me, it was like no one's telling folks that they shouldn't come here, but I'm like, maybe we need a breather, because I don't think it's like not that we couldn't over time sustain and welcome people as we should, but maybe it's like, shit, we need to take a pause here because we have people sleeping in the street. Like that's not good quality of life for those people who are here. It's not good for quality of life of people who are in those communities. Like if you go out into Midtown, it looks like a totally different place. It's insane. Like I've never seen anything like it in my life. And I've been around, 9/11, and we've had Sandy, where people were homeless. You never saw any of that stuff. Like, of course, people have family and networks and stuff like that, but never seen anything spill out into the streets in my lifetime, at least. And it's insane for me, just walking around, going from like one month to the next, how it could go from like being in a state where it's, I guess, hidden from view to being so visible, right? But that communication, and I'll post this in the show notes, this article is that New York City is asking people to not come to New York City at the border, because I guess they're trying to dispel any communication that people are getting from where they're coming from, or at the border, in fact, right? Like if Texas is trying to send people for whatever reason, to New York City, I guess they're trying to catch it in their own way and be like, hey, if they try and put you on a bus, don't get on the bus. So it's just interesting how it's playing out. But to your point, there's like all types of communication maybe that we don't know about. But it's complex and it's
For sure. I think for that, to that point, working in operations and just how the back end of just how processes and systems are created, not everyone's voices are heard and not the right people are at the table, right?
sure.
To be able to say like, hey, this actually is not going to work. For instance, just me personally, when we were working at OC, just down to translating the flyers that they were handing out, right? DOE has a mandate of translating all their materials in all these different languages, but has anyone really asked the question of, does it make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because some of these people who are arriving to states don't have no education, probably only know their name, can only tell you their birth name, their when they were born, where they were born, and XYZ, but not down to like writing it down on a piece of paper, right? And to your point of just like, should we take a pause? Can we take a pause? I think for that, it's not a matter of taking a pause. I think it's a matter of the right people having to sit at the table and communicate with one another and how this can be approached, right? Because New York City is just the highlight of what's going on. And to your point of this has never happened before, it hasn't to this extent. But if we think about how this started, it's kind of like we were set up this way, where Abbott is just kind of, taking it upon himself and saying, we're going to bust them here. And this is where they're going with no other option. And you have no option. You're literally probably just put on a bus and being told to be sent here.
Sure.
I honestly, during that time of all those articles about Abbott and where he's sending folks, I don't think that there's been a lot of media on other states that folks were bused to. Like, I know that for a brief moment, they were being sent to Washington, D.C. and being left on random corners, right? Those articles are out there. And for that, I think ever since that happened, I really haven't heard anything about what Washington's doing. Did they approach it so well that we just aren't hearing about it anymore? And can Washington and New York City sit at a table and talk about it? What are you doing that we can do to kind of help what's going on, right? Because again, it goes down to creating systems and operations and putting people in place and having people talk to one another. And it's really not the communication. It's the way that it's being thrown on New York City, I think, is really putting people in a corner of having to pick and choose which side they want to pick.
Yes.
And for me, it's not really about picking, it's about viewing it from an empathy point of view, because again, these people have families, they have kids, they want a better life just like anybody else does. And we've been able to manage to coexist in New York City for so long. Why is it now becoming a problem? And again, it's the highlight of just being on the media and the way that it originated from, the way that it started, and the lack of communication that people are having. It's really not on the people who are living in New York City, right? We want to help. There are people who genuinely do want to help and want to be there and want to welcome, but because it's being thrown at such a fast capacity, or quote unquote a fast capacity, they just aren't prepared and are being side-eyed or like just thrown from the left field of just, all right, all these folks are here, how are we going to help them? And again, what is Washington, D.C. doing that New York City can be doing better? And if there's another state where folks are being bused to, what are they doing to support? And how can we all work together to support people, right? If New York City is not the place that has the capacity to support, where can we pull in other resources and support from to get them help? And for me, it's just that point of view of empathy and just really getting down to the nitty gritty of how it started. It's not us, it's not the New York City residents, and I understand the frustration and again the divide in all of it. But um, for me, it's not about being divided. It's about empathy and welcoming and being supportive of folks who are arriving. And when it comes to how it's being managed, that's a whole bigger conversation
Oh
with
yeah.
a whole set of leadership that needs to be able to sit down and have a conversation about
Yes.
it. Because
Yes.
again,
At
it's
varying levels. Absolutely.
and it's right, and it's only called a crisis now because it's that's how they're putting it out to be. And
Mhm.
I don't view it from a point of crisis. I view it from we had COVID, it shut down everything. People were still going through what they were going through. America got back on track, and now we're ready to support back again. And it's
Sure.
only going to feed into the economy of just down to taxes if you want to talk about it. But
Yeah.
yeah, so many different point of views. And for me, it's just empathy and a much broader conversation of where and how it started to get
Yeah.
to this point.
Absolutely. And I started looking into some of that to try and get the vantage point of those who are sending folks up here. Now, it is incredibly horrible, I think, that people are used as political pawns to like take jabs at each other. Like, I'm going to talk crap about you and how you're managing the border. Okay, screw you. Well, I'm going to fly people up to New York. I'm going to bus them to New York. And then I'm going to criticize you for you busing people. Like, that is just like insane. But I did actually was curious, like, what is it? Is it even a crisis at the border that they have to do this? And there is some criticism about there being inactivity, and I think a certain level of acknowledgement at the president's level, at the federal level, that we do need to do some immigration reform. But there's been no news, at least that I've heard, about what they're proposing we do differently and how they're going to address this, right? Because you are going to have people who want to come in here, or come here in general, right, as a country to New York City. But like, how do you manage that better? How do we reform it so the process is modernized to meet the needs and uh, is modernized just for the year that we're in, and in our times, and to be responsive to what people need. Like, people should not be waiting for years to get work permits. If the concern is that people are not contributing financially, then we should make that process easier, because the reality is that many folks do want to come and work here, but the process of working legally is incredibly difficult, takes a very long time, is layered in bureaucracy, red tape, etc. And so it's just a catch-22 in some regards, but it is political. But in going back to my original point, is that I was actually just looking at different news outlets in Texas, and you have some of these border towns who really are just expressing challenges, right, of people arriving and being able to manage it, and then also like folks coming in varying means that are unhealthy, unsafe, not for themselves even as well, right? Like, these very crazy ways of trying to access the United States, and them having to encounter that and manage that. So it perhaps is different. I think it is different because people are not getting bused there and left there, but they're dealing with different sort of aspects to this. So to your point of like, this needs a broader conversation, sort of realizing that, and it's sad because it's dumped on New York City. And I have my perceptions of like how that's being managed, but it is also a level of support from the state. And to your point of like states working together, or the federal government coordinating a response for states to work together to get people in spaces where they do have capacity. Because, we do have 8.8 million people here. And I'm like, I don't know how many more people we could take, because we'll talk about that in a second. But like, we do have our slew of things that, like, our house is not in order, I guess. So it's hard to say we're going to take on so many people who do need more, right, resources in some ways. Like, we have worked in that world where you see like coordinating translation of materials, having bodies to translate materials, just like in an event that can lead to millions of dollars, right, on an annual basis, just for that alone. And then if you need to get services, provide housing, stuff like that. So I think there is some legitimacy to there being costs, but what is the federal government doing to support? And I feel like there's been crickets in terms of trying to help us with, getting states to play nicer together, or for states who have the capacity to take people, to provide shelter and to support giving them resources. Because, to your point about COVID, if we enacted all these policies at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, in response, I get it was like a health emergency. But that moment taught us that if we want to make something happen fast, we can, right? You can make the red tape green for a little while. Why can't we make the red tape green for, to make it easier for people to get into housing, to get jobs, to start accessing resources so they're not out sleeping in the street? But I think, if we had people arriving, again, it wasn't as visible because people were in communities. You just didn't see it in the same way. Now that it's sort of like you see them in hotel ballrooms, you're seeing them out in the street, you're seeing them in tents and makeshift cots and shelters and stuff, that like, how can we help people progress beyond that point? And it's disappointing in some regards to see that we aren't getting the help that we should be getting. And I'm actually going to be sharing some resources for people to reach out, because you made a great point of like it being split, pick a side, right? You have some people who are like, we really need to help these people. Don't be ignorant, let them in. And then you have some people who are like, not in my community. I don't want to pay for this. And I'll say that I think there's legitimate points to both sides, right? For a myriad of reasons. We just got to find the middle, which I don't know if we can ever do, but I'll just say there are pros and cons to each side. And I don't think that anyone's wrong. It's just people come at it from a different perspective and a different lens. And so how do we get support to make this, I don't know, it's a very tricky situation, but like I'll be sharing resources because we do need people to intervene. Like, I don't think it's right for someone, and say this with all due respect, okay, you're standing at the bus welcoming people and you're smiling for the cameras, but that's not helping that person. You need to be doing something else. If you're a congressperson, a senator, the president, the secretary of, Homeland Security, you need to be advocating for making this better, because for our city, for sure, I'm sorry, I don't want to see this get worse. Like this stuff with people spilling out into the streets, that's not okay, because what's going to happen? People are going to leave. It lends itself to other things for those people, for us. Like that's not the resolution, but that's also, it's not that it's not their fault also, right? And there should be some humanity to those people who are sleeping in the streets. And I agree with you on the point of empathy. I don't know if you've ever seen the Handmaid's Tale. Have you ever seen that show? But basically, it's like all these women who are trying to escape a country because they're trying to, they do this thing to turn some women into like childbearers, and those that aren't childbearers are turned into like laborers. And some women go to seek asylum, or families go to seek asylum in Canada. And I'm like, who knows? There could be something that happens. We see all these national disasters happening with these wildfires. You never know. Even within your own country, you might have to pick up your house, your child, your family, and go someplace. And I think you would like to hope that someone will come and welcome you, and that you're not out sleeping in a street or in a tent. You know what I mean? So there is a level of empathy, because you never know the circumstances that could result in you being in a situation, whether it's immigration, result of a natural disaster, or whatever. But there should be a way of doing it so people have a good quality of life. And there is a lack of responsiveness from a lot of people in a substantive way. I don't want to see you shaking hands on a bus. I want to see you getting out there and like getting money to help these people, helping us get people to safer environments, encouraging other communities to take people, because it shouldn't just be New York City, like that type of stuff. So that was a lot, but I just reacted to a lot of what you said, because I'm like,
No, for sure.
yeah.
It is a lot. I think just talking about it, there are different perspectives, there's different point of views, and it's neither here nor there, but just the approach of coming from it with just, again, my empathy. I'm always going to come back to that, because New York City, it's just the most welcoming city that I think anyone can come to. Like, there's such a diverse group of people, down to street vending, down to Queens, Brooklyn. Like every borough has their own charisma, their personality. And we as a city, we have a lot of empathy, and we see it in so many different ways with how just overall how the United States reacts to different things. I feel like we're always on a front line of welcoming and accepting, and basically hauling ass to support and do the work. And to your point of just the cameras and all of that, I think to that it's how it's being interpreted in the media that you're consuming, whether that's the Spanish news channel Univision, that's at New York One, or that's on TikTok, or that's on Instagram, or that's on Twitter. all these different outlets. But yeah, I would always come from it from a point of view of just empathy, and these people definitely the communication. They've got to start talking.
Yeah.
We're just the highlight of it all.
And I do want to go back to your point about communication, because it's interesting what you said about folks sort of being moved to a certain community, and it seems like it's been a difficult thing. Like if you communicate, and I'll just tell you, I've seen this myself, where we had a school being proposed to be used as a migrant shelter, and the community, like, was a huge level of backlash from people from all backgrounds. Honestly, is an immigrant community. Like, I don't live in a traditional I can't even say a traditional, but I live in a melting pot of a community, and it was there was some resistance in that area to use it for that purpose, and they wound up scrapping it. So it's sort of like, if you communicate, or if people catch wind of this, the guard comes up, right? Like, not in my neighborhood, not in my community. So that's probably why I'm sensing you probably have these things just popping up last minute. But then it also is a crappy situation to find out from seeing it that something has been sort of popped up in your neighborhood. And there is, I think, also, like you said, like, lack of communication, clarity, and perceptions of people coming. And one of the things that I heard from someone is like, well, these people aren't being vetted. We don't know who they are. And that's not true. Like, actually, to get through the border, these people are held for a period of time. They are vetted. There's like an asylum application process that happens, and then they are let into the United States while their immigration case is processed, but they're not, just crossing a river and popping up here. I think that's the misunderstanding. A lot of the folks who are coming here, how they got on the bus was because they were vetted through some space, right, that collected their information, that initiated a case for them. That's how we have information about these people. So, do you have like an extensive history, background checks? That I can't speak to. I don't know, but there is some level of vetting and filtering of people who are coming in, but I don't think that that's communicated to people. So right away, it's the defense of like, I don't want these strangers. I don't want these people that we know nothing about in my community. And also, too, the way that they do it is not great. Like, I was driving around the other day, I forget where I was, and there was just all these guys sitting out on the sidewalk on the street. And then that's what you see. And then what are people's reactions going to be to that, right? It's not like the people you see and then they're going into apartments and they're showing up to work and stuff like that. It's like these concentrations of people just at these shelters, and then them out in the street, and then back into the shelters. And I think that's like what's creating the aversion to people. But it is a lack of communication. But I also think the communication kind of what do you call that, like, it puts people in a guarded state. So it's like, if you are trying to do outreach to spread people into communities, like they were proposing sending people up by Albany, the community was like, no, we don't want those people here. Trying to send them to Jersey, they're like, oh, what are you talking about? I escaped New York City, I came to the burbs to escape all that stuff. Why are you sending people here up, into the northern New York counties? So it's like, I think the catch-22, you try and communicate, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's like some level of like, we're just going to do this because if we let people know, they're going to shut it down. And then what do you do? Right. So it's sort of like, people do have this aversion. It's like, well, we want them in New York City, but not in my neighborhood.
Right. To that, again, just the whole thing of how it's being managed, and your talk of just communication. And I will also add that it's also, people can go on Google and kind of, do your own research, interpret it your own way,
Yeah.
understand how this originated, not even as of the last 3 years, but just overall how the United States has been approaching the immigration and quote unquote migrant crisis that's now coming to light and being called it.
Yeah.
Just a little reading, a little education of how immigration started would be a good one to start with, and just why I approach everything from an empathy point of view, not just as an individual who was a first immigration child, and just even in myself and educating myself, and just how people who view even myself, right? In high school, I learned that at a certain point in the United States, immigrants who were having children on U.S. soil were being called anchor babies. They weren't being called U.S. citizen babies, right? Or just a child in the United States. We were called anchor babies to be able to identify children who have parents of undocumented kids. And I recall just walking around high school calling myself an anchor baby, where the staff were kind of predominantly white. And it kind of just made a little bit of uncomfort, but it's more so like, this is what it's called. This is what we were being viewed as. And now you have that point of view of like, this isn't an anchor baby, right? But where did anchor baby come from? It's all these like the history of this United States. So a little education of how it started, learning about it and being open to your own interpretation versus you being influenced to kind of see it a certain way, could definitely go a long way and just help people get to the empathy point of just being welcoming.
Sure.
Overall in New York State. I only speak to the city because born and raised here for over 20 years. Just I can't speak to Albany or all those other folks. I didn't even know that was happening up there in Albany, to be honest. Just comes to show, yes, you can come to New York City, right, and experience one thing, but once you hit up a different part of New York State, that can be a whole nother
different
fiasco and dilemma of itself.
Yes, it's definitely a whole different vibe for sure. And again, it's understandable in some ways because it feels like a hot potato that everyone's passing to each other in some regards, because, some people's pushback is it's not that we're not welcoming to people, but like we don't have the funding to support this. And, it's a thing I sort of want to talk about too. Like we know from the work that we've done and as residents of New York City that there's a lot that we need to do for the people who were already here and the people who were born and raised here, right? And so we're talking about like a lack sometimes of good employment opportunities. We still have food insecurity. We have issues with affordable housing. Like so our article yesterday, like the rent is too damn high, right? You're trying to go anywhere in any borough. It seems like everything is incredibly expensive. We need more schools. We need more modern schools, right? Not only do we need more buildings, but we need the ones that we have to be modernized because they have all types of issues. And we need better schools. We need more resources for our schools. My son gets special education services, others do as well. It's like, hey, we need more resources. If the world of, these certain types of conditions are increasing, we need more support, right? More systems, more infrastructure to support kids who have special needs and programs, after school programs. We see so many kids getting into like shooting at each other and getting into fights and showing up in Union Square. And I'm sorry, it's my personal opinion, but like rioting over a fucking PS5, like you have stuff like that, right? And I'm like, we need stuff, like we need more youth intervention programs and giving productive ways for people to be engaged in life as opposed to like just TikTok and Instagram or whatever. It's my just personal opinion. I'm starting to get old because I'm like, these young people, it's like how I know I'm getting older, but it's just my personal opinion. Our streets and our parks definitely could use investments, right? Like our green spaces and playgrounds for our kids. We need access to healthcare. We have increases in crime. That's not like a fake thing. You got all types of people doing all types of crazy things. We have homelessness, and we have like this thing in the news where recently they shared, like we officially have more people who are migrants in our shelter system than people who were, already, unfortunately, is documented listed as homeless and in our shelter system here in New York City. So it's sort of like challenging because, it's not to say again that we had this utopia where everyone was getting everything that they needed and everyone was living this great life. The reality is like we needed money for ourselves to do things better. This, of course, ways we know we could use our money in better ways, having worked in government. But it's like, how do you take on? And that could be, part of the aversion of it. And we got, I think, like mere pennies to what we're using to fund other things and support other humanitarian efforts to take on these folks here. So it's like, maybe it's not an aversion, but like a real reality that costs money. And, if we send them someplace else, hey, they want someone to take out a checkbook and say, well, how are we supporting these people in the interim, right? Or how are we like alleviating policies to get them folded into our economy somehow or into our communities, right? So they can work and they're not just sort of like sitting idle. but also like not draining a space that already needed additional resources, because it is not a pure utopia here. We do have lots of needs for the folks who live here. And so it's like, what is that balance? Or maybe it's just stating a fact of that's why where some people might be feeling sort of this apprehension to taking on more, or it is that people do need to chip in and support. You know, we send, I can't, like I said, New York City, we have a lot of money here, or at least a lot of money is generated here, right? And I tried to find data. I was like, how much money do we send out to the federal government, and how much do we actually get back? And I couldn't find like consistent information, or like the numbers seem way too low, something like 30 billion. I'm like, there's no way that that's all we send out. Like, there's no way. And maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like with all the money that's generated here, with all the business, with all of the bodies in New York City and New York State, we probably send a terrific amount of money out to the federal government. I know for a fact we don't get back as much as we send out. A lot of our federal money goes to support other states and stuff, which is a fun fact people don't know. But,
Oh, I actually didn't know that one.
yeah, like if you look at certain states, and people can do their research, but there are certain states who don't generate enough money to manage their infrastructure. And so funding from other states like California, like us, Connecticut, are used to fund and support other states. So that's a fun fact people can delve into. But all that to say, like, what kind of support are we getting if we're passing like bills and laws to support foreign countries and giving them aid, which is totally understandable. But like, I think we may need resources at some point. And so I don't know if you have any reactions there, but certainly like just trying to understand why people might be apprehensive. Like for me, it's like, not that I mind people being here, but it's like there is a certain level of practicality to it continuing the way that it is, right? And then also too, I think a certain level of, I guess, cynicism too. Like we've seen how people are being used as like political pawns. So it's really hard. Like you said, you have to look at your own information. I'm like, are you portraying it in this way to like fearmonger and scare people? Or is this like actually a crisis and we need help? But either way, I do think it's important. I agree with you that people need to like do their own research and come to their own conclusion. And I'll share a lot of links for people to look into this and to advocate in whatever way you want. Like there's links to organizations if you want to donate that are helping people. Like you mentioned, they're on the front lines. They've done this work. But I'd even listened to a recent, it was like I think it was on NPR, but this one woman, they're an organization in the Bronx. She's like, look, we've been working with this community and this like in the service area for a long time, but like our staff are tired and we need money, we need support, we need people. And so it's like we can't just rest on the folks who have been doing this for a while. That doesn't mean that it's easy for them. And if we keep going at this rate, like what's it going to look like? So all that to say, it's like a need for support from people perhaps beyond New York City to help us level out, right? Because it's not like we can control who's coming in, and it's not like we can control who's coming here.
For sure. I think a couple reactions to the flow of all of that.
Yeah,
It's
I'm sorry. I've been told that I talk a lot and I connect a lot of ideas, but
no. I appreciate you connecting dots and kind of, just bringing everything to light, just because it's things that most people don't think about or are too afraid to kind of just put it out in the light and get a reaction out of it. For me, again, I think we'll go back to communication and the people who need to be having conversations at certain tables, and where all of this different type of funding is going to, again, with the highlight of quote unquote the migrant crisis in the last 2 to 3 years. It kind of starting from what I recall, shortly right after the pandemic and kind of going back to quote unquote normal. And yes, we need all this funding for school. We need all this funding, our education programs, our homeless population, and all of these things. But that, I will say, it's a conversation way above us and where our funding is going. Yes, we're paying taxes, but do you actually understand where all of this money is going? And what percentage of what money is going to different types of agencies throughout the entire United States? I can only speak to New York City just because I'm more familiar with it, but understanding, one, what's the total, right? What's the total money that we're kind of, talking about? Where is it all kind of trickling down to? Where are we prioritizing it? And if you're not aligning with those priorities, what are we doing as an individual to kind of make sure that those priorities are being heard at those tables or at
Sure.
that level, right? Because again, migrant crisis is being highlighted because of all these things that are happening. And it's because New York City residents and all of these people and all of US citizens are speaking about it, right? But can we have that same level of energy speaking about our own situations that are happening, right, in our very own
Sure.
streets, about education, about homelessness, and all of these things? Are we not yelling loud enough about it? Are we not talking about it enough? Um, the same way. So it's a much bigger conversation there. And
Sure.
I will say, just like, to your point of just the youth, right, in general, like, yes, they definitely need that support. They're returning back from COVID after 2 years of
Yeah.
not socializing with one another. And I feel like I can definitely speak to that, one, just having worked in education for a couple of years at a middle school and a high school level, and just recently with what's happened recently to my family, right? Where my husband was unfortunately a victim of one of these shootings that happened in New York City, and how
Mhm.
that just completely shattered us and broke us. And what resources did we have? And I will say that it wasn't much.
Yeah.
I think the people who were put in place to support us just weren't trained enough, or just didn't know enough. And I know enough because I've been my mom's advocate in all of
Sure.
these different types of offices, interpreting, understanding all of these documents that have to be filled out, understanding what does and what doesn't have to be filled out. Working in administration and
Mhm.
operations overall gave me that advantage point to be able to support my family. But what about the families who don't get that type of support? And again, it
Sure.
goes back to us yelling loud enough about where we want our resources to go. And if we want it to go to a certain way in education specifically, let's yell about it. Are you out here doing the gritty work of, putting it out there? Are you talking about it just in your smaller circles? Um, and sometimes people don't like to have these conversations because it can spike a fight, it can cause a division, it can cause
Sure.
XYZ, but just have the conversation, right?
Sure.
Come from it from a point of empathy and just
Yeah.
communicate. You
Yeah.
just have to be able to communicate with one another about all of these things. And if we want the money to move a different direction, let's speak up about it and yell about it as loud as we are just complaining about the
Yep.
migrant crisis that's happening. And I
Yep.
only say complaining because it's really an outcry, right, from different communities of what's going on.
Sure.
And I'm hearing it, I get it. But my thing is empathy, communication. Do you really understand where this is originating from? And
Mhm.
do you know that you can actually do these different things to be heard and actually have a, a, a say? And I only say that from my perspective. Not everybody says that you can have a say, right? But you can yell, you
Yeah.
can make noise, and we can move it a different direction if we just come together and yell out enough,
Sure.
and bring it the attention that it needs.
Sure.
Because we could definitely highlight it for stretches of time and make it happen. But I think it's just the effort. We have to put the same effort that we're giving this and attention to the migrant crisis into our own things as well. And
Yeah.
I
It's
think we
true.
don't give it that much attention. And I
Yeah.
say it just, I've always been yelling about it since as long as I can remember, and as early as I've entered this world of just professionalism and in my career. It's something that I've always pointed things out. I mean, in my teenage years, definitely a little rowdier and unprofessional, but as I got
Sure.
older, there's ways that you can communicate. There's ways that you can self-educate to be heard and to also teach others about it.
Right.
And that's just me coming as a first generation child who I didn't know how to register to vote. I didn't know how to do X, Y, Z. I didn't even know that I can have a say in all these different things. But one, I'm a first generation child. Two, this isn't really taught in school. We just
Mhm.
during your college application, there's this little check mark. You want to register to vote? Check. Fine, I
Yeah.
did it. But then what happens after that, right? At 18, am I really going to read all these a little fine prints of here's how you do everything? I'm more so okay, I'm probably going to read this, but it
Yeah.
also probably isn't going to have all the information I need can I have a hand holding?
Sure.
So that's my point of view. It's
Sure.
just so much bigger than us, I think, and approach as a citizen and being a New York City resident, it's my approach is always empathy and communication, just
Yep.
because it's empathy. These are humans, these are people.
Yeah.
They're not they're not really coming here. Well, they're not coming here to harm. They're really coming here to work and to something better. And if you visit their country as a tourist, you're seeing a totally different perspective from the actual campos and pueblos that they're actually living in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just,
I
yeah,
mean, yeah, even I've heard some people share that recently that that they're going to a tourist destination from a cruise ship or from, I don't know, a resort that they're staying in. Even in that little trip, you could see a difference in the quality of life of what you're used to. And it can be sobering, right? For the things that we take for granted sometimes, as like basic basic things, like even in New York City, stuff like having a shelter, having running water, having heat for the most part. I know some people, there's issues with that. It's a whole separate conversation, but yeah, and it's just the circumstances and the conditions and the opportunities that are available. And many people before us came here seeking the very same thing. I'm a product of that. I'll say that, right? People came here trying to find a new life, different life. And, here I am a few generations later, and our family has progressed generation to generation and evolved. And I'm super grateful for that. And I think other folks of cultural backgrounds can say the same thing. So I agree. It's like empathy and also like honoring our history. Like, where did you come from? Where did your ancestors come from? How would you have liked someone to have treated your ancestors? And how can we be mindful about that? Because this could be someone's story, right? 100 years from now of what their grandfather, great grandfather, grandmother, great grandmother, etc., went through to get here, and their stories. And so,
yeah.
uh,
There's so many stories I feel like that are out there of that, but not much of them are even heard. Like
yeah,
it's just even just culturally in the United States, you don't really hear much about the Latino history or just the immigration crisis overall. It's kind of something you learn as you're growing up and it's like, oh, it's happening, right?
hmm
If you're not directly affected, but you might have a neighbor who is, you might have a best friend who is. You just don't know until you know and just approach it from that point of view of just empathy and trying to understand from their perspective, put yourself in them in their shoes.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely, absolutely. I will say that. So I definitely took away like empathy. I know that word has come up a lot, but it's sort of trying to humanize, right? I say it's like empathy and humanization of the folks who are coming and their experiences, not only like where they're coming from, but the experience in getting to New York City has been so many sort of, I imagine, varying perspectives and experiences, some that probably were traumatic. Even when they get here, I can't even imagine having to sleep in a ballroom with my kids. I mean, obviously, if I were coming from a horrible situation, some shelter is better than none. But again, I've never had to experience that. And it's something that I pray I never have to experience. So it's trying to humanize what that's like, or, not having food or not having clothes or, fill in the blank, so many different things. I think it's a level of empathy and humanizing the people that you see on the news, and increasing communication. Like, I think that's a murkier one, right? Because again, sort of just to our point, you have some folks who are open to having and supporting these folks who are coming into the city or into surrounding areas, and you have those that are a little more apprehensive for a myriad of reasons. But if there are ways that we can expand, I guess, knowledge and awareness around who's coming, why they're coming, and trying to, I guess, advocate, right? It's also communication, to your point of like, I'll say I'm guilty of this, and it's hard. You're going through your day to day, you're working, you have your kids, you have your families. It's like there's certain systems that evolve around us and function and thrive, but they're complicated and inaccessible. Like, I couldn't even begin to tell you how to get to certain hearings or how you can contact certain people because they just make it so complicated. And it seems like very inaccessible. But I agree. I think that's something that we have to work towards, escalating. Whatever. And I hate to say side because I feel like there's a little bit of a conspiracy in me, but I'm like, I feel like every few months there's a new thing coming out trying to get us to pick a side. The migrant crisis is one of them. Are you Republican? Are you Democrat? Are you pro or you con? Or, like, there's just so many things. So I definitely try to encourage us to not fall into that rhetoric, because it's, it's divisive and unhealthy for us who are in it, in the thick of it in so many ways. But if based on your perspective and your concerns, I agree with you wholeheartedly, is people need to get active and communicate to people who are in decision-making spaces to do things differently. If you're not happy that people are out in the street and you're a concerned business owner because, people aren't coming into your business, they're not feeling safe, or it's, a sanitation issue, etc., you're escalating maybe to, or maybe you're not, but those are things that people need to be vocal about. And it's not just internally in the city, but the people beyond the city who represent us, who can advocate for the funding, who can advocate for the resources. And so I definitely think there's something to be, there is something to be said there. And I thank you for raising that point, and I wholeheartedly agree. And allowing people to do research and learn a little more, and draw your own conclusions. So I'll be sharing some resources that I found, like every link and article that I read, I'll be sharing with people, and also be sharing this link with how it's like find your representative or something like that, where you plug in your address and it generates everyone that represents you at the local, state, federal level. Also share the name of the folks who represent or are supposed to be responding here in New York City to this at the federal level, at the federal agency level. So if folks are really feeling a way, in whatever way you feel, you need to start communicating that it's a challenge and folks need to come in and help, because at least the way it is right now and how it's portrayed and how it's, I don't know if it's managed, how it's portrayed, or how it's panning out. But, we do have an influx of people, and it's tragic because it's not the quality of life that they should have or that they envisioned, right? I can imagine, I can't speak for people, but I'm going to imagine you didn't think you'd be sleeping in a hotel ballroom or out in the street or in a cot out in Randall's Island or something like that. I don't think that's what people envisioned. And then also they're sort of limited, right, in what they can do. So they're just sort of stuck in like this limbo for a long time. And there's a way that could be improved for sure if people really cared to take a risk and create something. Executive orders, if we did it in COVID, we could do it now, get creative, fucking take a leap and say, hey, we're just going to make an executive order and change this, and then we'll readdress it later. But it's just like a lot of inactivity. And also, if you're concerned about it hitting your community, then you got people around you and they need to escalate for support. And at the end of the day, all those people work for us. And so our voice should matter just as much as a mayor escalating for federal support. So I feel like I agree. The more voices are amplified, hopefully the more of a response that we'll get. So I encourage people to look up their representative and to reach out to them and express their concerns, whatever they are and whichever viewpoint you're coming from.
Yeah, and I was to that of just like no pressure on just, having to feel like you need to be out here advocating and, making signs and yelling and doing all of that. For me, I'm not a person who's going to be out here yelling, to be quite honest. I'm not going to be in someone's face. I'm not going to be rallying just because that's not part of my personality, but part of the way that I do it is simply just community service, right? And understanding what's going on, putting myself out there, reading and educating myself consistently, even today with all these new things that I've heard that I haven't heard about before. Just if something touched, just go down a rabbit hole of just learning a little bit more about it. I think people would be kind of in awe, or just like whoa moment of just like, wow, there was much more to unravel than you actually think, because it's so much more than just this. It's so big.
Yep, absolutely. So, oh my gosh, so more to we'll see how this all pans out, right? But I guess ultimately it comes down to at a personal level, trying to explore your understanding, right? Your beliefs, your interpreting, I guess, revisiting your beliefs, the knowledge, the things that you think you know, and trying to dig a little bit deeper, trying to empathize, trying to humanize, but also, again, trying to advocate for some change, and advocate for whatever it is that you believe is needed to address this and to make, to improve the quality of life and the response to this, because it is multifaceted. There is no answer. But I so appreciate you sharing your experience. For those who may not have encountered it, as a person who grew up here, it was not my experience. My experience was very different. And something that I take for granted, but it's also something I'm very grateful for, because I know there's a lot of obstacles that I didn't have to encounter that other people did, or experiences and things they had to encounter. Discrimination.
And that's beautiful. I will say that
stereotypes.
It's just the generations, right?
Yeah.
While I may be first generation, I am one of 5 kids. I don't want the next generation to experience that, right?
Sure.
So it's more so like, we're here, yes, we're doing all of these things, but we're also working on making sure that the following generations are, living life. They're okay. They're supporting. I mean, we've worked in government for how long at this point, and giving back to public service. So just to highlight that, like, yes, you didn't do it, and that's beautiful. Like, you didn't experience it. That's beautiful, but you're also like aware of all these things that are happening, right? Educating and seeing it from all these point of views, and being open to listening about it, and just the empathy part back to that. I know I keep saying it and repeating it, but it's really where I come from, and just view it and view absolutely everything that's going on around here, with not only this, but everything else that's happening around us, because this is one topic of so many other things that are happening around us.
Sure.
Sometimes you can get angry, yes, but also the empathy. We're
absolutely.
all human at the end of the day.
Yes, indeed. And you said you're first generation, and I'm just going to share like my praises. I feel like if people ever didn't realize, and again, it's things that sometimes people take for granted, having been, so many generations removed from that like initial experience of coming here. But a lot of us probably can trace back to lineage of folks who immigrated to the country, and it's humbling in a way to hear certain experiences. But I'll say, like, you being first generation, like, I have seen your work ethic, and you are incredibly hardworking. You are ballsy, like, you make sure that people are doing the right things, and you advocate and you voice your concerns because you want things to be better, and you're contributing to the economy. You're doing your thing. You're professional. You're ambitious. You're a great mom, and you contribute to the city in so many ways. So if ever I could give a testament to people who are first generation, that you are like example of someone who is doing their thing, and why we need to support folks, and those who are so many generations in and now might be like homeowners and business owners, but like, we forget because we're so many years or generations sort of separated from that. There's a lot to be said about investing in people and the potential that they have, and we shouldn't generalize, and we shouldn't forget that history. But I just wanted to call you out. I think you're extraordinary, and you're doing your thing, and you're an example of why families, why they come here, and like the impact it can have for the kids that they come with and the generations to come. So you keep at it, and I thank you for joining today.
Thank you so much for your kind words.
Of course.
If y'all couldn't see me, I will almost bawl, but I probably do after the camera. So don't worry about it. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy to bring that kind of first generation perspective, and just hope that the more people come from it, like, just view everything from a point of view of empathy, we can do so many more things.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Crystal. And we'll be sharing more resources, and I welcome any feedback that folks have and ideas, and we'll see what sort of comes of this, and there might be a follow-up conversation. We'll see how this pans out in the next few months. But thank you for bringing this perspective and this lens, and we'll see what change it makes. I appreciate it.
Of course. Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao.